On a bright Tuesday morning, Sarah Mitchell woke up earlier than usual. The sun was just starting to peek through her bedroom curtains in her luxurious San Francisco penthouse apartment. She had an important meeting in Los Angeles, and her private jet was scheduled to depart in 2 hours. As the CEO of TechVision Enterprises, one of America's fastest-growing technology companies, Sarah was used to tight schedules and important meetings. At 45 years old, Sarah had worked incredibly hard to reach where she was today. Starting from a small apartment in Chicago's South Side, she had graduated from Harvard Business School with honors and climbed the corporate ladder through pure talent and determination. Her dark skin and curly hair, which she now wore naturally, had often made her stand out in the predominantly white, male tech industry. But Sarah had always used this uniqueness to her advantage. That morning, Sarah chose to wear her favorite navy blue business suit, paired with pearl earrings that her grandmother had given her. She believed in dressing professionally but never flashy, letting her work speak louder than her appearance. Her assistant, Jessica, had already arranged for her Mercedes-Benz S-Class to be brought to the front of her building. As she rode the elevator down from her penthouse, Sarah checked her phone one last time. There were several important emails about the upcoming meeting in Los Angeles, where she was planning to announce a major investment in private aviation infrastructure. TechVision was expanding its interests, and this $500 million deal would revolutionize how private aviation terminals operated across the country. The doorman greeted her warmly as she stepped out of her building. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell. Your car is ready." Sarah smiled and thanked him, appreciating how some people could be professional without any prejudice. Her driver, Michael, who had worked with her for 5 years, held the car door open. During the 30-minute drive to the private airport terminal, Sarah reviewed her presentation one more time. The roads were surprisingly clear for a Tuesday morning, and she enjoyed watching the city come to life. San Francisco had been her home for the past decade, and she loved how the fog rolled over the hills in the early morning. As they approached the private terminal, Sarah noticed it was quieter than usual. Only a few other cars were parked outside, and she could see her sleek Gulfstream G650 waiting on the tarmac. The jet's white surface gleamed in the morning sun, and Sarah felt a sense of pride. It wasn't just about luxury. It was a symbol of how far she had come. Michael pulled up to the terminal's entrance and got out to open her door. Sarah gathered her leather briefcase and designer handbag, both gifts she had bought herself after closing her first billion-dollar deal. The terminal's glass doors reflected her image, a confident, successful black woman ready for another day of breaking barriers. "Have a great trip, Ms. Mitchell," Michael said, handing her the bags. "I'll be here when you return this evening." Sarah nodded and walked toward the terminal entrance. She could see a security guard watching her through the glass doors, and something about his expression made her pause for a split second. After 20 years in the corporate world, she had developed a sixth sense for detecting prejudice. The guard's body language and the way his eyes narrowed told her this might not be a smooth morning after all. The automatic doors slid open, and the cool air-conditioned breeze hit her face. Sarah took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked forward, her pilot's confirmation email ready on her phone. She had faced discrimination before, but today would be different. Today, she wasn't just any passenger. She was about to become the majority stakeholder in this very terminal. Little did the security guard know that his actions in the next few minutes would not only change his life, but would become a turning point in the private aviation industry's approach to diversity and inclusion. Sarah Mitchell was about to show him, and the world, exactly what power looked like. Ted Wilkins had worked as a security guard at the private terminal for 8 years. He prided himself on knowing who belonged and who didn't. When he saw Sarah Mitchell walking through those glass doors, his prejudices immediately took over his judgment. "Excuse me, ma'am," Ted called out, quickly moving from behind his desk. His hand rested on his security badge, a habit he had when trying to show authority. "This is a private terminal. I think you might be lost." His voice carried that familiar condescending tone that Sarah had heard too many times before. Sarah stopped and turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. "Good morning. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and I have a flight scheduled for 8:30 a.m. She opened her phone to show him the confirmation email, but Ted barely glanced at it. "Ma'am, this is for private jets only," Ted said, emphasizing each word as if speaking to a child. "The regular terminal is about 2 miles down the road." He gestured dismissively toward the exit, stepping closer to block her path to the security checkpoint. Several other passengers in the terminal looked up from their phones and laptops. A few began to whisper among themselves. Sarah noticed one older white gentleman shaking his head disapprovingly, though she wasn't sure if his disapproval was aimed at her or the guard's behavior. "I'm well aware this is a private terminal," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "I'm the CEO of TechVision Enterprises, and that's my Gulfstream G650 on the tarmac." She pointed through the large windows at her jet, which had her company's logo clearly visible on the tail. Ted laughed, a short, harsh sound that echoed through the quiet terminal. "Right, and I'm the King of England." He crossed his arms across his chest, his security badge glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Listen, I've been doing this job for 8 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't." Sarah pulled out her company ID, her pilot's confirmation, and her government-issued identification. "I suggest you look at these carefully, mister." She glanced at his name tag, Wilkins. "And I'd also suggest you think very carefully about your next words." But Ted wasn't backing down. He barely looked at her documents. "These could be fake. Look, I don't want any trouble, but you need to leave before I call the police." His hand moved toward the radio on his belt. By now, the terminal had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching the scene unfold. Sarah noticed several phones pointed in their direction, recording the interaction. She smiled slightly, knowing that social media would soon be buzzing with what was happening. "By all means, call the police," Sarah said calmly, pulling out her own phone. "But first, let me make a quick call of my own." She dialed the number, maintaining eye contact with Ted. "Jessica?" "Yes. Could you please come to the terminal? And bring Mr. Anderson from the charter company with you. It seems we have a situation that requires immediate attention." Ted's confidence wavered slightly when he heard her speaking with such authority, but he stood his ground. "Ma'am, I don't care who you're calling. This is a secure facility, and you're making a very big mistake," Sarah interrupted, her voice still composed but carrying an edge of steel. "Would you like to know exactly how big of a mistake, Mr. Wilkins? In about 5 minutes, you're going to find out that not only am I a legitimate passenger, but I'm also about to become the majority stakeholder in this entire terminal operation." The color began to drain from Ted's face, but his stubborn prejudice kept him rooted in place. Other staff members had started to gather, watching the scene with growing concern. A young female employee behind the check-in counter was frantically making phone calls, likely to management. Sarah stood perfectly still, her designer heels planted firmly on the marble floor, her briefcase held confidently in her right hand. She had faced discrimination before, but this time was different. This time, she had the power to do more than just complain. This time, she would create real change. The next few minutes would transform not just Ted Wilkins's career, but the entire private aviation industry's approach to diversity and inclusion. The confrontation was about to become a catalyst for something much bigger than a simple security check. The tension in the private terminal continued to build as Sarah Mitchell stood her ground. Instead of responding with anger, she reached for her phone again, this time opening the camera app. Ted Wilkins's eyes widened as she began recording their interaction. For the record, Sarah spoke clearly into her phone. "It's 8:05 a.m. on Tuesday, and I'm being denied access to my scheduled private flight by security guard Ted Wilkins. Despite showing all required documentation, I'm being refused entry based on what appears to be racial discrimination." Ted shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that his actions were being documented. "Stop recording. That's not allowed in the security area." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his growing nervousness. "Actually," Sarah responded calmly, "this is a public space within the private terminal, and recording is perfectly legal. Now, would you like to explain on camera why you're refusing to verify my legitimate credentials?" More passengers had gathered around, and Sarah noticed at least 5 other phones recording the scene. A young woman in a business suit gave her an encouraging nod, while an elderly couple whispered disapprovingly in Ted's direction. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant Jessica. 5 minutes away with Mr. Anderson. Terminal director also coming down. She allowed herself a small smile, knowing that support was on its way. But this wasn't just about resolving her own situation anymore. "Mr. Wilkins," Sarah continued, her voice steady and professional, "I want you to understand something. Every second of this interaction will be used as a training example for what not to do in customer service. Your actions today will serve a greater purpose. Ted's face had turned red, but he stubbornly maintained his position. I'm just doing my job, protecting this facility from unauthorized. From unauthorized what, Mr. Wilkins? Sarah interrupted, raising an eyebrow. From a well-dressed business executive with complete documentation? Or is there something else about my appearance that makes you assume I don't belong here? The young woman at the check-in counter finally gathered her courage and spoke up. Mr. Wilkins, I have Ms. Mitchell's flight details right here on my screen. She's authorized for access. Her voice trembled slightly, but she stood firm. Ted glanced back at her, betrayal written across his face. Jenny, stay out of this. I'm handling the situation. No, Mr. Wilkins, Sarah said firmly, you're creating a situation. There's a difference. She turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. I want everyone here to witness this moment. This is how change begins. Not with shouting or violence, with calmly standing your ground and documenting injustice. Several people in the crowd nodded in agreement. A businessman in an expensive suit stepped forward. I've seen Ms. Mitchell at several aviation conferences. She's exactly who she says she is, and this treatment is absolutely unacceptable. The main terminal doors swooshed open, and Sarah's assistant Jessica rushed in, followed by Mr. Anderson from the charter company. Both looked concerned and slightly out of breath from hurrying to the scene. Miss Mitchell, Jessica called out, her heels clicking rapidly across the marble floor. The terminal director is right behind us, and the board has been notified of the situation. Mr. Anderson, a tall man in his 50s, looked mortified. Ms. Mitchell, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for this treatment. Mr. Wilkins, he turned to the guard, his voice sharp, step aside immediately. But Sarah raised her hand. Actually, I'd like Mr. Wilkins to stay right where he is for a moment longer. She turned back to her phone camera. I want to document one more thing. This is how privilege and bias work. Notice how quickly the situation changed when other people validated my identity. The same credentials I showed 5 minutes ago weren't enough on their own. The terminal had fallen completely silent, every person hanging on her words. Even Ted seemed frozen in place, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Sarah's phone continued to record, capturing every second of what was quickly becoming a viral moment in the making. The next few minutes would demonstrate exactly how a powerful woman handles discrimination, not with anger or vengeance, but with dignity, purpose, and a plan for lasting change. The terminal director, James Henderson, burst through the doors, his face flushed from rushing down from the top floor. Behind him followed 2 more board members who happened to be in the building for an early morning meeting. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple security check. Jessica, Sarah's executive assistant, had already positioned herself between her boss and Ted Wilkins. She held an iPad displaying Sarah's complete flight documentation, company credentials, and most importantly, the documents detailing TechVision's upcoming majority stake purchase in the terminal. Ms. Mitchell, James Henderson spoke, slightly out of breath. I just got word of this situation. Please, let me express our deepest. Mr. Henderson, Sarah interrupted calmly. Before we discuss apologies, I'd like you to observe something interesting. She gestured toward Ted, who was now speaking with Mr. Anderson. Notice how your security guard's entire demeanor has changed since white employees arrived to validate my presence. Indeed, Ted's body language had completely transformed. Gone was the aggressive stance and condescending tone. Now he stood nervously, his eyes darting between the terminal director and the floor, his earlier confidence deflated. Mr. Wilkins, Sarah called out, her voice clear and commanding. Would you please explain to Mr. Henderson why you refused to accept these same credentials when I presented them 5 minutes ago? The terminal fell silent again. Everyone waited for Ted's response, but he merely shifted his weight from one foot to another, his face growing redder by the second. Jessica stepped forward, her tablet still displaying Sarah's documentation. For the record, she spoke professionally. I have here Ms. Mitchell's pilot confirmation, her company ID, her government-issued identification, and preliminary documents regarding TechVision's upcoming acquisition of terminal operations. One of the board members, an older man named Richard Gates, visibly paled at this last piece of information. Acquisition? He whispered to his colleague. Sarah smiled slightly. Yes, Mr. Gates. TechVision Enterprises was planning to purchase a majority stake in this terminal as part of our expansion into private aviation infrastructure. The papers were supposed to be signed this afternoon in Los Angeles. She paused meaningfully. Though given this morning's events, I believe we'll need to reassess that decision. The crowd that had gathered began murmuring. Several employees looked worried. They understood that their jobs might be affected by what had just transpired. Jenny, the young check-in counter employee who had tried to help earlier, stepped forward bravely. Miss Mitchell, I know this has been horrible, but please know that most of us here aren't like. She glanced at Ted, then back to Sarah. We're better than this. Sarah's expression softened as she looked at the young woman. Thank you, Jenny. And I noticed your attempt to intervene earlier. That kind of courage is exactly what we need more of in these situations. Mr. Henderson was now in full damage control mode. Ms. Mitchell, please, let's move this discussion to my office. We can. Actually, Sarah interrupted again. I believe this conversation needs to happen right here, where everyone can witness it. My entire career has been about breaking down barriers and creating transparency. Let's not hide this behind closed doors. Jessica handed her boss a fresh bottle of water and whispered something in her ear. Sarah nodded and checked her watch. Her flight to Los Angeles would need to be delayed, but this was more important. The terminal's regular operations had completely stopped. Other passengers, pilots, and staff members stood in a loose circle around the scene, many still recording with their phones. This wasn't just about one security guard's actions anymore. It had become a moment of reckoning for the entire private aviation industry. Mr. Henderson, Sarah spoke again, her voice carrying across the silent terminal. I think it's time we had a serious discussion about systemic changes. And since everyone here has witnessed this incident firsthand, they should also be part of the solution. The support system that had rushed to Sarah's aid was now watching her transform a humiliating experience into a powerful teaching moment. In the next few minutes, she would outline changes that would reshape not just this terminal, but private aviation facilities across the country. Sarah Mitchell opened her briefcase and pulled out a leather portfolio embossed with the TechVision logo. The terminal remained silent as she placed several documents on the nearby counter. Every eye in the room focused on her deliberate movements. Mr. Henderson, she began, her voice carrying through the quiet terminal, I'd like to share something with you and your board members. She spread out the papers, revealing detailed investment plans and contracts. TechVision Enterprises isn't just planning to invest in this terminal. We're preparing to revolutionize private aviation across the country. The documents showed plans for a $500 million investment across 15 private terminals nationwide. This terminal was meant to be the flagship location for a new era in private aviation services. The board members leaned forward, their eyes widening as they scanned the figures. As you can see, Sarah continued, pointing to specific sections of the documents, this terminal was chosen to be our model facility. We plan to implement new security systems, staff training programs, and customer service protocols that would set the standard for the entire industry. Mr. Gates, the board member who had earlier whispered about the acquisition, now looked physically ill. Ms. Mitchell, surely we can discuss this privately. This unfortunate incident with Mr. Wilkins is exactly why these changes are necessary, Sarah finished firmly. She turned to address the crowd of onlookers. What happened here today isn't just about me. It's about every person who has ever been judged based on their appearance rather than their credentials. Jessica stepped forward with her iPad, pulling up a presentation that displayed TechVision's success statistics. TechVision has grown 300% under Ms. Mitchell's leadership in the past 5 years, she stated clearly. Our company's diversity initiatives have been featured in Fortune magazine, and our training programs are considered industry benchmarks. Ted Wilkins, who had been standing quietly to the side, seemed to shrink with each word. The young check-in agent, Jenny, was frantically taking notes on a notepad, clearly understanding the historic nature of this moment. Sarah pulled out another document from her portfolio. This, she held up the paper, is my personal investment in this terminal, not TechVision's. Mine. I believe in transforming spaces that have traditionally excluded people like me. She paused, letting her words sink in. But transformation requires accountability. The terminal director's face had gone from apologetic to desperate. Ms. Mitchell, please. Whatever changes you want to implement, we're open to discussion. Your investment would be revolutionary for our operations. Yes, it would, Sarah agreed. And it still can be. But first, she turned to face Ted directly. We need to address the systemic issues that allowed this morning's incident to happen. She walked slowly around the counter, her heels clicking on the marble floor. I'm not interested in just firing one security guard or making a public apology. I want complete reform. She gestured to the gathered crowd. Everyone here today will be part of that change. Jessica distributed tablets to the board members, each displaying a comprehensive proposal for new security protocols, diversity training programs, and hiring guidelines. The documents had been prepared weeks in advance, but today's incident made them even more relevant. My power, Sarah spoke clearly, doesn't come from my ability to buy this terminal. It comes from my commitment to changing it. She looked directly at Ted. Mr. Wilkins, your actions today will serve as case study number 1 in our new training program. Your mistake will help educate thousands. The tension in the room shifted. What had started as a discriminatory confrontation was transforming into a masterclass in leadership and systemic change. Even some of the other passengers who had been annoyed by the delay were now nodding in appreciation. Sarah gathered her documents back into her portfolio. Now, Mr. Henderson, shall we discuss the terms of this investment? I believe your boardroom would be appropriate for that conversation. She turned to Jessica. Please reschedule my Los Angeles meetings. Something more important has come up. The power move wasn't just about showing her authority or financial influence. It was about seizing a moment of discrimination and transforming it into an opportunity for lasting change. As Sarah walked toward the boardroom, followed by the terminal's leadership team, everyone knew they were witnessing the beginning of a significant transformation in private aviation. Within 30 minutes of Sarah Mitchell entering the boardroom, the private terminal transformed into a hub of frantic activity. Security personnel rushed to clear the space where Ted Wilkins had stood, as if trying to erase any trace of the confrontation. The young check-in agent, Jenny, found herself suddenly promoted to interim security supervisor. Terminal Director James Henderson emerged from the boardroom looking pale and shaken. He immediately called an emergency staff meeting in the terminal's main lobby. Employees gathered quickly, their faces showing a mixture of concern and curiosity. Effective immediately, Henderson announced, his voice carrying across the quiet space, "We are implementing new security protocols." He glanced back at the boardroom where Sarah was still meeting with other executives. "Mr. Wilkins has been relieved of his duties, but that's just the beginning of our changes." Sarah's assistant Jessica moved efficiently through the terminal, distributing newly printed guidelines to all staff members. The papers outlined immediate changes to security procedures, customer interaction protocols, and reporting mechanisms for discrimination incidents. Every single employee, Henderson continued, will undergo mandatory sensitivity training starting tomorrow morning. Ms. Mitchell's company, TechVision, will be providing their award-winning diversity programs to our entire staff. The news spread quickly through the aviation community. Within hours, social media exploded with videos of the incident. #PrivilegeJetWhileBlack started trending, and numerous news outlets began calling the terminal for comments. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from other executives and civil rights leaders. In the terminal's VIP lounge, a group of regular private jet customers discussed the morning's events. "I've known Sarah for years through business circles," said one CEO to another. "She just turned discrimination into a masterclass on corporate leadership." Jenny, still adjusting to her new role, approached the boardroom nervously with a stack of incident reports. As she waited outside, she could hear Sarah's clear, commanding voice through the door. "The training programs begin tomorrow. Every employee, from janitors to executives, will participate. No exceptions." Outside in the main terminal area, passengers who had witnessed the incident were sharing their recordings online. One video had already reached 1 million views, showing Sarah's calm handling of Ted's discriminatory behavior. Comments poured in praising her composure and strategic response. The terminal's marketing team huddled in their office, frantically drafting a public statement. Their usual carefully worded corporate messages seemed inadequate for this situation. Finally, they decided to simply quote Sarah's own words about transformation and accountability. By early afternoon, other private aviation companies began calling. They had seen the viral videos and wanted to know more about TechVision's diversity training programs. Sarah's assistant started a waiting list for companies interested in implementing similar changes. Ted Wilkins cleared out his locker under supervision, his face a mask of regret and embarrassment. As he walked past the check-in counter, Jenny handed him a final paycheck and a copy of the incident report. "This will be used in training programs nationwide," she informed him professionally. Sarah emerged from the boardroom after 3 hours of intense discussions. The terminal staff stood straighter as she walked past, noting how she nodded approvingly at the already visible changes. Security guards who had previously been stationed at fixed posts were now walking around, engaging with passengers respectfully. "Jessica," Sarah called to her assistant, "please send the new protocols to all our partner terminals. Today's incident may have happened here, but the changes will be implemented everywhere we have investments." The terminal's atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Employees who had witnessed the morning's discrimination now moved with new purpose, understanding that they were part of a bigger transformation. Several staff members approached Sarah to thank her for not just firing Ted, but for using the incident to create systemic change. As the afternoon sun streamed through the terminal's large windows, Sarah finally prepared to board her delayed flight to Los Angeles. She paused at the spot where Ted had tried to block her that morning. Looking around at the already transformed terminal, she smiled slightly. Sometimes, she thought, discrimination could become the catalyst for change that affected not just one person or one company, but an entire industry. The immediate impact of that morning's incident would ripple through private aviation for years to come, and it all started because one woman chose to respond to discrimination not with anger, but with powerful, purposeful action. Over the next 3 months, the private aviation terminal underwent a complete metamorphosis under Sarah Mitchell's guidance. The physical changes were immediately visible. New signage promoting inclusivity decorated the walls, security stations were redesigned to be more welcoming, and the staff uniforms were updated to project professionalism rather than intimidation. Sarah personally oversaw the implementation of TechVision's comprehensive training program. Every Monday morning, employees gathered in the terminal's newly created training center, where they learned about unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and professional customer service. "Remember," Sarah would tell each new training group, "what happened that day with Ted Wilkins wasn't just about racial bias. It was about challenging our assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces." The employees would nod, many of them having watched the viral video dozens of times. Jenny, the former check-in agent who had stood up to Ted, flourished in her new role as security supervisor. She implemented a welcome first policy where every passenger was greeted with a smile before any documentation was requested. Her team became known for their perfect balance of security and hospitality. The terminal's transformation attracted attention from across the aviation industry. Other private terminals sent their managers to observe the new protocols in action. Sarah made sure these visits included conversations with staff at all levels, from cleaning crews to executives, ensuring everyone understood their role in maintaining an inclusive environment. One morning, a young black female pilot walked into the terminal. The security team smoothly followed Jenny's new protocols, checking her credentials with professional courtesy. Later, the pilot sought out Sarah, who was overseeing some new installations. "Ms. Mitchell," the pilot said, tears in her eyes, "I've been flying for 8 years, and this is the first time I wasn't questioned multiple times about being the actual pilot." Sarah hugged her, understanding exactly what this meant. The terminal's business actually improved after the incident. Many prominent executives, particularly those from minority backgrounds, specifically requested to use this terminal when traveling through San Francisco. They wanted to support a facility that had turned a discriminatory incident into positive change. TechVision's training programs became so successful that Sarah established a separate division just to handle the demand from other companies. The original videos from the incident with Ted were now part of a larger training package, showing both what went wrong and how to handle similar situations correctly. 3 months after the incident, Sarah organized a special event at the terminal. She invited civil rights leaders, aviation executives, and even Ted Wilkins himself. Ted arrived looking nervous, but Sarah had a surprise planned. "Mr. Wilkins," she addressed him in front of the gathered crowd, "your actions that day could have ended with just your termination. Instead, they became the catalyst for industry-wide change." She handed him a folder. "These are letters from aviation employees across the country, sharing their experiences with discrimination. Would you be willing to join our training team, sharing your story of how unconscious bias can blind us?" Ted, who had spent the past months reflecting on his actions, accepted the offer with tears in his eyes. His story of transformation became as powerful as the original incident, showing that change was possible even for those who once perpetuated discrimination. The terminal's staff grew more diverse with each new hire. Sarah made sure the hiring panels themselves were diverse, bringing in perspectives that had previously been missing from the aviation industry. The terminal began hosting monthly networking events for minorities in aviation, creating a community that extended far beyond its physical walls. By the end of 3 months, the terminal had become a model for the entire private aviation industry. Visitors could feel the difference as soon as they walked through the doors. The security team worked with quiet efficiency, treating everyone with equal respect. The check-in process was smooth and professional, regardless of how a passenger looked or dressed. Sarah often stood in the same spot where she had confronted discrimination that day, watching the transformed terminal in operation. She saw diverse groups of passengers and crew members moving through the space with confidence, knowing they belonged. The transformation wasn't just about new policies or procedures. It was about creating a space where everyone felt valued and respected. What had started as one woman's stand against discrimination had grown into a movement that was reshaping private aviation, one terminal at a time. 1 year after the incident that transformed private aviation, Sarah Mitchell stood at a podium in the terminal's newly built conference center. The room was packed with journalists, aviation executives, and industry leaders from around the world. Behind her, a large screen displayed the headline, "Aviation Excellence Award, Most Inclusive Private Terminal 2024. A year ago, Sarah began her speech. "I walked into this terminal and faced discrimination. Today, I stand here not to celebrate an award, but to celebrate a change in culture." The audience, which included many familiar faces from that fateful day, nodded in agreement. The terminal had become famous for more than just that viral incident. Its new training programs have been adopted by over 200 private aviation facilities worldwide. The security protocols developed by Jenny, who is now the head of customer experience, have become industry standard. In the audience sat Ted Wilkins, no longer a security guard but now a sought-after speaker on unconscious bias. His transformation story had touched thousands, and his honest accounts of his own prejudices had helped others confront their biases. He caught Sarah's eye and smiled, grateful for the second chance she had given him. Last month, Sarah continued, "We welcomed our 10,000th passenger under our new protocols. Not a single discrimination complaint has been filed in the past 8 months." The audience broke into applause. Statistics showed that customer satisfaction had increased by 87%, and the terminal's revenue had doubled. The changes went far beyond just this one terminal. TechVision's aviation division, born from that incident, now partnered with flight schools to provide scholarships for minority pilots. The terminal's monthly networking events had grown into a national organization supporting minorities in aviation. Jenny stepped up to the podium next, presenting data from the past year. "Our staff diversity has increased by 200%, she announced proudly. "But more importantly, our employee satisfaction rates are at an all-time high." The screen behind her showed photos of the diverse team that now ran the terminal's operations. In the front row sat the young black female pilot who had thanked Sarah months ago. She was now the leader of Wings for All, a mentorship program that helped minority aviation professionals navigate the industry. The program operated from an office right in the terminal. Sarah unveiled the terminal's next initiative, a nationwide certification program for inclusive aviation facilities. "Starting next month," she announced, "any private aviation facility can apply for our gold standard inclusion certification, but they'll have to earn it." The certification process would be rigorous, requiring facilities to demonstrate not just diverse hiring practices, but also inclusive cultures and proactive anti-discrimination policies. Already, 50 terminals had signed up for the program. Local schools now regularly brought students to tour the terminal, showing them that aviation careers were accessible to everyone. The walls that once displayed generic aviation photos now showcased diverse aviation pioneers and current professionals, inspiring the next generation. But our proudest achievement, Sarah said, her voice becoming emotional, is the letters we receive. She held up a thick stack of papers. These are messages from aviation professionals who say they finally feel at home in their industry. That's the real measure of our success. The terminal had become a case study in how to transform discrimination into positive change. Business schools taught the incident and its aftermath as an example of effective crisis management and cultural transformation. Sarah's approach was studied and replicated across various industries. As Sarah concluded her speech, she asked everyone who had been present on that transformative day to stand. About 20 people rose, including Jenny, Ted, and several passengers who had witnessed the incident. They received a standing ovation from the crowd. The lesson we learned, Sarah said in closing, is that change doesn't have to wait for the next generation. It can happen the moment we decide to transform our pain into purpose. The audience rose to their feet again, this time joined by millions watching the live stream worldwide. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the terminal, observing the lasting changes. New passengers were being welcomed with respect, diverse crews moved confidently through security, and the walls displayed the terminal's new motto, Aviation Excellence Through Inclusion. What had started as one woman's stand against discrimination had become a blueprint for change across an entire industry. The terminal stood as proof that with the right leadership, even the most entrenched biases could be transformed into opportunities for growth and inclusion. As Sarah looked out the terminal's windows at planes taking off into the sunset, she smiled. Sometimes, she thought, the most powerful changes start with one person simply refusing to accept the status quo.